This is the turning point right here. This is when Antiochus XIII really kicked the Ptolemies out of Palestine. Chapter 5, the Seleucids. You think the Ptolemies were convoluted? The Seleucids are worse. We have outsiders coming in and becoming kings. There's still the same number of marriages, outsiders, marriages of sisters and brothers and that kind of thing. But it's much more convoluted, as we'll see as we go along. Okay? So this is the chart we show every time. We're still right here in the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8. Greece was the goat, Alexander the Great was the great horn, the four horns, Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy the first, and Seleucus the first were the four horns, and the little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. We will talk about him today historically, but we will talk about the bad things he did to the Jews next week, because I want to tie together the things that he did to the Jews, the horrible, horrible things that he did to the Jews, and have in your mind very fresh why the Maccabees revolted against that. So we'll talk about his atrocities next week, but we'll talk about his history this week. These are the four horns. We're talking about Seleucus at the very bottom, Seleucus I Nicator today, one of Alexander's generals, an officer of Perdiccas, another one of the Diadochi, but he helped murder him later. He became the ruler of vast territory and established the Seleucid dynasty. So here's the chart we do every Sunday, I think. The entire history of the intertestament period. This is a chart based on Palestine, okay? So it's really easy, if we talk about just Palestine, this little thin sliver of time right here, these three rulers, Antiochus III, Seleucus IV, and Antiochus IV. Those are the only rulers over Coele-Syria, over Palestine during this time. But we're going to back up and take a look at all of the Seleucids today, okay? So the delineations of the period were Antiochus III the Great takes Coele-Syria from Ptolemy V in 198 BC during the Fifth Syrian War. If we have time, we'll talk about the Syrian Wars at the end of the talk today. I don't know if we'll get it that far or not. The end of the period is not very much later, but the Maccabees under Mattathias wrest control from the Syrians in 167 BC, and the Jews become semi-autonomous. This is the family tree of the Seleucids. Oh, what a mess. You can see that, right? I can't even see it from here. Same thing. Blue boxes are Seleucid rulers, a bunch of them, blah, blah, blah. We have some outsiders here. I'll go through that in just a minute. You can go to table 5.1 in the book, page 132 through 133, that goes with the chart on page 135, and it has just a kind of a mirroring information. Seleucus I started it all. He could be a red dotted box because he really was an outsider for the Seleucid kingdom. And all the Syrian rulers from 323 to 62 were Greek. Notice some connections, first of all, between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Now, we talked about this with the Ptolemy chart last week, but these are some different connections. Some are the same. Antiochus III married Bernice over here. This is an important marriage because this marriage begat the Third Syrian War. We'll talk about that later on, okay? Cleopatra I Syra, she was a Seleucid, but she married Ptolemy V. Antiochus IX, or Antiochus VIII, actually married a Seleucid, Cleopatra V. He married another Seleucid, Tryphena. Antiochus IX married Cleopatra IV, Cleopatra V. Antiochus X married Cleopatra V. What a mess. I'll show you that love. I call it a nonagon. You hear of a love triangle, but it's actually a love irregular pentagon at least, and maybe an irregular nonagon. So I had to look up what a non-sided figure was. We'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so the green box here, Cleopatra, right here, you can't tell it from here, but she's surrounded by a red dotted box. She was born a Ptolemy. If you go to the Ptolemy chart from last week, you'll see her on there, but she was actually a Seleucid ruler. The good thing about Cleopatra is she doesn't have any family above her in this chart. That's kind of cool, right? That's good because it makes a nice delineation line for the top half of the chart and the lower half of the chart. We're going to blow up this lower half in just a minute. There were several outsiders that came along in purple boxes. Notice they don't have any family ties. Diadochi Tryphon here. Alexander Balus claimed but was not, probably. He claimed to be a son of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Alexander II claimed to be a son of Antiochus VII. And down here, Tigranes of Armenia doesn't have any family ties either, but he took over the Seleucid kingdom toward the end of the Seleucid kingdom. Okay? And then check out the nonagon between Ptolemy IX, Ptolemy, Antiochus IX, Antiochus VIII, Antiochus XII, married to these women, Cleopatra IV and Cleopatra V. If you have the book, you can go look and see those details in quite a bit. So quite a bit of weirdness going on there. Okay, there were a lot of inter-family marriages also. Antiochus married his stepmother, Stratonice. Antiochus II married his first cousin. Antiochus II married his first cousin, Laodice I. It's hard to see for everybody. Antiochus, just plain old Antiochus 6b, married his sister. Seleucus II married his first cousin. Seleucus II is right here. Seleucus IV married his sister and sister-in-law. Antiochus IV married his sister. Demetrius I married his sister. I have homework for you. Who did, this one's a harder one of the ones, who did Antiochus III marry? If you have the book, go see if you can figure that out. Let me know the answer tonight, next Sunday, whenever. Okay, who did Antiochus III marry within his family? The winner of the number of siblings/husbands contest is Laodice IV, right here. She had Antiochus the fourth as a husband, Seleucus IV as a husband, Antiochus, plain old Antiochus as a husband. Okay, so she was the winner. Even beyond the Ptolemies, she had more husband brothers than anybody else. And as I mentioned, there's a good delineation line between the top part of the chart and the lower part of the chart at Cleopatra Thea. So let's cut the chart off. This is the lower half of the chart. The only lines coming from above are the sons of Demetrius I Soter, which is Antiochus VII, and Demetrius II, and also the claimed son of Alexander IV, who was Alexander Baelus. All right. So, we're going to talk about very briefly. There's a lot of detail here, and it's real easy to get bogged down and really wrapped around the civil wars that were going on at this time. But in general, the civil wars were between the descendants of descendants of Demetrius II, Antiochus VIII, right here, who's the son of Demetrius II and Cleopatra Thea, and the descendants of Antiochus IX, who was also Cleopatra's son through a different husband, Antiochus VII. Okay. So the Civil War, those factions basically split the Seleucid kingdom in two. Okay. Later on, we see another civil war. Remember last week I talked about time slices? I always show you the family tree, and then I also show you a timeline of the rulers, and I showed you the tables that I have in the book. I had time slices of the Ptolemaic leaders. Okay. Same thing here for the Seleucid leaders. What I'm showing you here is a time slice number 41 actually in the book, and I'm going to show you it on the timeline just in a minute also. So later on we had civil wars where Antiochus XI and Philip I, who were probably twin brothers, were fighting in a civil war within their own part of the civil war. Demetrius III, another brother. So I have him in brown. I started running out of colors because of these civil wars. And they were all fighting against Antiochus X. So that is time slice 41. It shows how difficult this is with everybody fighting and taking different parts of the kingdom and that kind of thing. Here's the timeline. Again, you probably can't see this timeline very well, but look at the big picture. Try to step back and see the forest instead of the trees, okay? Length of the bars show relative stability of the kingdom. Red and green are good bars. Red and green together are bad bars. We have relative stability in this part of the kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom. We see some conflict here between the brothers, Seleucus II and Antiochus Hierax. Actually, it was called the War of the Brothers, which is this black box here, which is one of the events. Okay, the whole Seleucid timeline could be the War of the Brothers. I mean, everybody was always in war with each other in the timeline. Okay, but relative stability. Every now and then we have some conflict, but relative stability. In purple are the Six Syrian Wars that happened here. We alluded to those last week, and we'll talk specifically about 4 of the 6 Syrian Wars. The first 2 were kind of boring, just basically land grabs. The last four, Syrian Wars 3, 4, 5, and 6, were interesting, and we'll talk about that if we have time. I hope we do have time. Okay. Oh, some events. As we go along, these will become obvious how significant these events were to the history. We talk about the War of the Brothers. We had the Battle of Raphia, which is very important historically. It was the Battle of the Tanks, the elephants of the day. The Battle of Panium is when Antiochus III basically got control of Coele-Syria. He gets total control of Coele-Syria in 198 BC. We have the Treaty of Apamea, which is a treaty between Rome and Syria, where Rome just decimated Syria. Just decimated them with this treaty. Just crushed them. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay? We also have the Day of Eleusis, when Antiochus the 14th was put to a stop with the line in the sand around him by the Roman consul. So the Romans they were the big guys in the neighborhood. They were the big guys on the block. You didn't want to mess with Rome. And they submitted, they made people submit to their will pretty big time. Okay? The last half of the kingdom is in this chart. Notice the instability of the kingdom. Lots of red and green bars. So here's two brothers. I don't remember if they're brothers. No, not two brothers, but two people that ruled together against this person. This person, in the first part of his reign, ruled against that person. Lots of instability in the kingdom. And then the kingdom pretty much falls apart at the end. So we have easy time slices. We have more complex time slices. Let's go look at time slice 41, which is right here. It's this little blue time slice that goes right up through here. So we see Demetrius III in brown, because I'm running out of colors. We see Philip I and Antiochus 11 in green. We see Antiochus 10 in red. So at least you can you don't know the details of the civil wars. We just can't go into that kind of detail today, but at least you can see who was fighting against each other in a chart like this. In this chart and also the table that I have that go along with the chart. There were four major periods of the Seleucids. Their rise and expansion, from the founding by Seleucus I Nicator to the beginning of the reign of Antiochus III the Great. Antiochus III the Great was really a pretty amazing guy. He was the golden age of the Seleucid Empire. But his golden age ended because of Rome, the Treaty of Apamea that we'll talk about. Then we had their decline in Roman interference from the Treaty of Apamea through the reign of Antiochus VII. And then we have internal strife and fragmentation where the empire just falls apart into civil wars, and Rome finally comes in and says, enough, let's just take over, let's just crush them once and for all, be done with it. All right, so the rise and expansion here in green, I have the little key here. Seleucus I Nicator, we talked about him already. He was one of the four horns. He was a general of Alexander the Great. He founded a bunch of cities, one of which is in the New Testament. Antioch in Syria was founded by Seleucus, and it's mentioned in Acts 11:19. He seeded some, now remember that animation, you probably don't, but we had an animation of Alexander the Great's kingdom, how it boom, 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 and spread all the way over to the Indus River. I guess from your perspective, boom, 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 this way. Spread all the way over the Indus River, beyond the Indus River into the subcontinent of India. And we saw that when Seleucus took over, it expanded or decreased back. That was because Seleucus traded some of this territory back for 500 tanks. Elephants. Elephants were the tanks of the day. They were the best thing ever. So he got 500 elephants in that little trade. That's why we see that territorial expansion of Alexander the Great kind of come back across the Indus River. Okay, he was assassinated in 280 BC by Ptolemaic Empire, a son of Ptolemy I Soter. Next up, Antiochus I Soter. We have the First Syrian War during his reign. First part of that was against the Ptolemy who killed his dad. Antiochus II Theos. We have the Second Syrian War. He founded a city, Laodicea, that we see in Revelation 3:14, one of the seven churches of Asia. He was poisoned by his ex-wife, Laodicea I, and this caused the Third Syrian War. Again, I'll get into that detail in just a minute. The Third Syrian War, because of this death and everything that happened here, the Third Syrian War happened in the reign of the Seleucus II. The greatest extent of the Syrian Empire was about 280 BC, after Seleucus I Nicator crushed Lysimachus at Corypodium. This is the extent of the kingdom. Pretty big. Much bigger than Rome, much bigger than Carthage, much bigger than the Ptolemies. Pretty big, amazing kingdom that Seleucus had. All right, some more Seleucid rulers. I have everybody listed here, but we're not going to talk about everybody. There's just lots of detail. Anybody that read the chapter, you know there's a lot of detail there, and it's really easy to get kind of wrapped up in it. But Antiochus III the Great, he was an amazing guy, the beginning of the Seleucids' golden age. He basically won back all the territory that had been lost under the previous rulers. Okay? Amazing guy. Seleucids reached their zenith during his reign. It just so happens the construction of the Great Wall happened around 214, started in 214 during his reign. The 4th and 5th Syrian Wars happened during his reign. And he won Coele-Syria in 198 from the Ptolemies after multiple attempts. I have in my book, I said, if at first you don't succeed, he was the kind of guy, Antiochus III, if at first you don't succeed, try again. You've heard that expression? Well, he was a guy, if at first you don't succeed, try again, and he finally succeeded. He finally ended up taking Coele-Syria in 198 BC. His success then became his downfall, though, because he was defeated by Rome in 190 BC in the Roman-Seleucid War toward the end of his reign, and there was much interference in the Syrian kingdom due to the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC. Huge defeat for Antiochus III. So they reached their zenith during his reign, and then things started falling apart at the end of his reign, as we see in blue, the decline and Roman interference from our key right up here. Seleucus IV, he attempted to loot the Jewish temple. If you're interested in a neat story, go read 2 Maccabees chapter 3. That's the story of him trying to loot the Jewish temple. He was kind of in a jam. He had all this bounty that he had to pay to Rome because of the Treaty of Apamea. He needed money somewhere, so he went and thought, well, the Jewish temple is a good place to get it. It didn't work out so good for him, as you read in 2 Maccabees 3. He had to send his son Demetrius I Soter to Rome as a hostage. One of the conditions of the Treaty of Apamea was that Syria, the Seleucids, had to send hostages to Rome for Rome to keep them. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was one of those. Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the little horn that we'll talk about. Okay? And also Demetrius II was another one, or Demetrius I, sorry. So Demetrius I, his son, Seleucus IV's son, was sent to Rome as a hostage in exchange for Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Okay, so Antiochus Epiphanes is now free to roam about, and he goes and roams about and causes all kinds of a mess. Yep, Antiochus Epiphanes is the little horn of Daniel chapter 8. The Six Syrian Wars during his reign, it was because of this Syrian war that he wreaked just total havoc on the Jews. Held captive in Rome for 12 years by the Treaty of Apamea. He started things out bad by appointing a Hellenized Jew to the high priesthood. And he did all kinds of things to the Jews. We'll talk about next week. Like I say, I want to tie those two things together. Okay? He would have conquered Egypt in the Six Syrian War if Egypt had not threatened him. Drawing a line in the sand. He had already conquered Memphis. He had already conquered all the Egyptian territories, and he was just about, within minutes of being able to conquer Alexandria, the main Egyptian city. And it didn't work out for him because Rome came along, drew the line in the sand. Antiochus said, give me some time to think about it. He said, think about it as long as you want. Just don't step out of the line and let me know what your answer is. Antiochus did not have a choice. He had to capitulate to Rome. And he handed Egypt back to the Ptolemies, and he walked off with hat in hand. Almost head in hand if he'd stepped out of the circle with the wrong answer. I try to come up with some justification for what Antiochus IV did to the Jews. Again, we'll talk about that next week. But he needed money. He also needed a buffer zone between Rome and his kingdom. That's not justification enough for what he did, but it is some justification. So he looted the temple, and he tried to set up this buffer zone with Coele-Syria between Syria and Rome. The Maccabean revolt, we'll talk about that next week, happened during his reign. He died a miserable death. He had pain in his bowels, swarmed with worms, his flesh rotted away, and because of his stench, the whole army felt revulsion. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Demetrius I, he was held captive by Rome, again under the Treaty of Apamea in exchange for the release of Antiochus IV, we just talked about. Alexander Belus claimed to be the son of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Demetrius II was the only Seleucid ruler during two distinct periods. He was taken captive by the Parthians. Now we see the Parthian Empire starting to rise. As the Seleucid kingdom started getting weaker, the Parthian Empire started to rise. So they were at war with each other. He was taken captive by the Parthians around 140 BC. Antiochus VI came along. He was killed pretty early. Probably a good thing given the civil wars, because that would have complicated things probably. Tryphon, he was a general in the Seleucid army, so he was a usurper to the throne. He served as regent for Antiochus VI until he killed him. Antiochus VII, he had some very successful campaigns against the Parthian Empire. In fact, the Parthians released Demetrius II, who they'd taken captive, hoping that these two brothers, Demetrius II and Antiochus VII, would go into a civil war against each other. Well, it didn't work out that way for the Parthians. Now we have internal strife and fragmentation. We see the second reign of Demetrius II, who was released by captivity from the Parthians, and the beginning of internal strife and fragmentation. Alexander Zavinus was another of the claimed adopted sons of Antiochus VII. And then Cleopatra the Thea. She is a Ptolemy who came in and ruled the Seleucid kingdom. Okay? She was a pretty good ruler at first, best we can tell, then not so much. Her descendants are responsible for all the civil war, just a mess. It's just a mess from Cleopatra down as far as the civil wars with each other and internal fighting, external fighting, just a total mess. But she killed her ex-husband, Demetrius II. She killed her son, Seleucus V. She tried to kill her son, Antiochus the Eighth, Grypus, by offering him a drink of wine. He came in from hunting or been out doing something all day. He was hot and sweaty, and she, have some wine. Oh, this was really out of character for Cleopatra. Thea. So he said, why don't you drink the wine instead? Ooh, backfire, plan backfired. So Cleopatra was killed by Antiochus VIII, killed his mom. We see some other rulers, 20 through 24. Don't want to go into details of those, civil wars basically. And we're kind of wrap up the Syrians now. Tigranes II of Armenia, he came in and took over the Seleucid kingdom from 83 to 69. He was also king of the Armenian kingdom from 95 to 55. He was a pretty powerful guy. He ruled the entire eastern Mediterranean up to the Caspian Sea. He essentially brought an end to the bloodline rule of Seleucus I, even though a few still recognized Seleucus VII and Antiochus XIII. Tigranes was ultimately defeated by Rome in 66 BC, but they allowed him to be a vassal state. He paid tribute to them, and he continued to be king until his death in 55. Okay? Seleucus VII was more like a local ruler, like a mayor. If you look at the timeline in the book, he's shown in a purple color. He was not really a leader of the Seleucid nation, but a local ruler. And Antiochus III and Philip II were the end of the kingdom. Antiochus XIII was killed by Pompey in probably 63 BC. Philip II was deposed by Pompey in probably 63 BC. And this was the end of the kingdom. The year later, Syria became a Roman province in 62. Wow. I talked too fast. Sorry. But we covered the entire Seleucids in a very few minutes. All right. Now, let's slow down just a minute and talk about the Six Syrian Wars. You've seen this chart before. I showed it to you last week. And I said I wanted to just introduce you to the chart, and we'll talk about it in more detail next week. Because I want you to know there's 6 Syrian Wars and who won, that kind of thing. But the details are coming today. All right. I did change one thing from the chart last week. I changed this to a draw. I added draw down here. So I had winners in green, losers in red. I added blue draw. Because this was instigated by Antiochus III. He had much success at first, and then Ptolemy ended up driving him back, and they basically ended up with the same territory. They just lost a bunch of men. They lost a bunch of elephants. But basically ended up kind of where they were before the war even began. So really kind of a draw, even though Ptolemy really kind of won the day, but he just basically kept the territory that he had. Okay? I'm going to talk detail about 3, 4, 5, and 6. The height of Ptolemaic power was during Syrian War number 3. The Battle of Raphia, the Battle of the Tanks, Syrian War number 4. This is a very important war, the Battle of Panium, the Syrian War number 5, when Antiochus III finally gained control over Coele-Syria. The Six Syrian War was when the Day of Eleusis happened, the line in the sand happened. That was the end of the Six Syrian War. So let's talk about those details. But first, we have the Treaty of Apamea, happened right here between the 5th and 6th Syrian War. In 188 BC, the 5th Syrian War ended in 195, then the Treaty of Apamea. Again, this was between Rome and Syria, not between the Ptolemies and Syria, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle in understanding all this stuff. And then the 6th Syrian War started, 18 years after that in 170 BC. All right. So, the 3rd Syrian War. Like I say, the first two were kind of boring. They were just tit for tat, get some territory, lose some territory, get some territory, lose some territory, kind of boring. The 3rd Syrian War gets kind of interesting because it starts getting personal. Antiochus II was married to Laodice I. That was his first wife. That's what the number 1 there means, okay? She probably killed Antiochus in 246, in July 246 BC. She said, I trust her completely, don't you? She said that, while he was dying, he said that my son Seleucus should be the king over the empire. Well, Bernice said, no. He's my current husband. I'm a widow because of him, because of what you did, basically. My son, who turned out to be named Antiochus also, my son should be the king over the kingdom, over the Syrian kingdom. Okay? Well, Laodice said, I'll fix that. In late summer of 246, she had killed this son, Antiochus. No problem, everything's fixed now, right? So Seleucus now becomes the king. Okay? Well, a little bit later on, maybe a month or two, Bernice was killed by probably order, or I'm not sure if it was the crowd that killed her or by order of Laodice or whatever, but she was killed in 246 BC. Prior to her being killed, she went to Ptolemy III, her brother, and asked for help. She said, Laodice has killed my son, your nephew. Let's do something about this. And before Ptolemy could even really do much about it, Bernice was killed, and then we had the beginning of the 3rd Syrian War. Ptolemy III declared war, and it was a big, big win for Ptolemy in the 3rd Syrian War. The 4th Syrian War, the War of the Tanks. This was instigated by the Seleucids, specifically Antiochus III against the Ptolemies, specifically Ptolemy IV. The Battle of Raphia was the big battle in 217 of this a battle inside the bigger war. We see that Antiochus had this many infantry, cavalry, and tanks. We see Ptolemy had this many infantry, cavalry, and tanks. Antiochus had 102 Asian or Indian elephants, so which are these right here. Now, if you go look at elephants, I didn't realize this until yesterday. I started looking at elephants. I was not big on understanding what elephants really are. There's a lot of different kinds of elephants. You have the African elephants, the giant, big, they're 11 to 13 feet tall or whatever. These big elephants with big ears and big tusks, very scary looking. But that's not who these sides had. Antiochus had these Indian elephants here, which were 10 feet tall. I have that circled here. Ptolemy had 73 fewer elephants, smaller elephants, 8 feet tall. This does not look like a good thing for Ptolemy, and it was not. These African elephants were very easily intimidated by the Indian elephants, and it was almost a disaster for Ptolemy until he finally, because of his infantry, his superior infantry, 70,000 versus 62,000, because of that, he finally was able to turn this battle around and finally won the day. And won the day is kind of a misnomer because it was basically a draw. The 4th Syrian War was basically a draw. The 5th Syrian War. Very important. It happened in the city of Panium, right here. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is now called Caesarea Philippi. You can go see that today. There's a mound there where Caesarea Philippi used to be. So the city used to be called Panium or Panius. Fought in 200 BC, about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. The Seleucids won a decisive victory here. They just annihilated the Ptolemies. They ended up conquering Coele-Syria and taking that in as part of their territory. This is really the turning point between the two. If we're concentrating on Palestine, this is the turning point right here. This is when Antiochus XIII really kicked the Ptolemies out of Palestine and took over in 200 BC. Okay? And then the Ptolemaic remnants of this war basically fled, whatever, and by 198 BC, Coele-Syria was firmly in control of Antiochus III, Antiochus III the Great. Okay? That is the turning point for us in our studies. Now, remember I showed you that line across there, the Treaty of Apamea, between Rome and the Seleucids. Okay? This was because of the Roman Seleucid War, also known as the Aetolian War. It severely, I should put severely in big letters in bold or something, severely weakened the Seleucid Empire. Now, the problem was the Seleucids and the Romans kind of viewed things differently. That kind of happens in wars, right? You know, I have my idea of the way things go. I have my idea of the way things go. Okay? So Rome really thought that Asia Minor should be their buffers. That's modern-day Turkey. This is a modern-day map of the Middle East, or the Mediterranean countries. So Rome thought that Asia Minor would be their buffer zone between the Syrian kingdom, which is over here, or all up here, and the Roman Empire, or not empire yet, the Republic over here. Okay? Antiochus didn't view it that way. He looked at Asia Minor as being his. I mean, he already occupied that, and that Greece was going to be his buffer zone. The Romans disagreed, and they had wars. So Antiochus invaded Greece in 192 BC. He was soundly defeated by Rome in the Battle of Thermopylae in 191. Different Battle of Thermopylae than we saw earlier. Remember Leonidas and the Greeks defending against the Persians. Same place, different history. So Battle of Thermopylae in 191 and again in 190 BC in the Battle of Magnesia, they just really trounced all over the Syrians, and they had to basically sign a peace treaty between the Syrians and Rome. This was a huge blow to the Syrians. He was forced to abandon much of his territory. He had to surrender his tanks, his war elephants, and not have any in the future. He had to have his navy destroyed. He was only left with 12 ships. That was basically just to keep rebellions down within his empire or whatever, but there wasn't much of a navy that Rome had to worry about. 12 ships. He had to supply 20 hostages to Rome. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was one of those. Demetrius II was another. Okay, we talked about that. He had to pay 15,000 talents of silver to Rome. That was a huge amount of money. He also had to give Rome 4.8 million liters of corn. That was a lot of corn. So a lot of money and a lot of corn. And he was forced to surrender all his prisoners. So this is what this looked like. Antiochus III controlled all this territory in yellow. Rome controlled this territory in red. We still have the Carthaginian Empire in purple. We still have the Ptolemaic Empire in green. But notice that Antiochus controls Asia Minor. Rome did not like that. Antiochus viewed Greece as the buffer zone between him and the Romans. The Romans viewed Asia Minor as a buffer zone between them and the Seleucids. This is why the war happened. That was the Treaty of Apamea, between the 5th and 6th Syrian Wars. Now, the 6th Syrian Wars is the line in the sand. They were having a war. Both sides, Ptolemy and Seleucus, sent emissaries to Rome asking for military support. That usually doesn't work out when you do that. I can tell you from history, don't do that. It's happened over and over again. It started by two Ptolemies, two regents of Ptolemy VI, who really didn't understand what they were doing. Syria won battle after battle. They took Memphis, Cyprus, much of Egypt, and were on the verge of setting foot in Alexandria and just totally taking over all of Egypt. They would have been a huge empire at that time, and Rome was not too keen on that idea. Okay? Antiochus IV, a Syrian, actually took Ptolemy VI, his nephew, under his guardianship during this war. They actually just took their king and said, okay, well, you're my nephew, come along, let's go get some ice cream. The Ptolemies appealed to Rome, and the Seleucids were within moments of completely taking Alexandria until Rome intervened in 168. A guy named Gaius Popilius Lanus, a Roman general and a consul, a former consul, which is a proconsul. We'll talk about all the officers of the Roman Empire quite a bit later. He ordered Seleucus to immediately evacuate Egypt and Cyprus and call off the siege of Alexandria. He's the one that drew the line in the sand around Antiochus IV. known as the Day of Eleusis because it happened in a community outside Alexandria called Eleusis. Happened in July of 168 BC. Antiochus IV had no choice. This is the last slide, I think. He had no choice. He was acutely aware of the massive damage that had been done by the Treaty of Apamea. 20 years earlier, he didn't step out of the circle. He said, all right, I'll retreat. And when he did, he was not happy. And he retreated back through Palestine, and he wreaked havoc on Palestine. We'll pick that up next week. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.